Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The August heat in Milwaukee that summer made everything feel heavy and slow, like the whole city was moving through molasses. I was 17, living with my mom and little brother Tyler in a fourth-floor walk-up on Prospect Avenue, where the hallways always smelled like someone's dinner cooking and the elevator broke down at least twice a month. My days were pretty routine. Morning shift at the frozen yogurt place downtown, then home to help Tyler with his summer reading while Mom worked her second job. Our building wasn't fancy, just one of those brick complexes from the 70s with thin walls and temperamental plumbing, but it was home. Most tenants had been there for years, and everyone knew everyone else's business whether they wanted to or not. That's how I first noticed Blake Hoffman from the 6th floor. Not because I wanted to, but because in a building that small, you couldn't avoid people even if you tried. He was 22, had just moved back in with his parents after dropping out of UW-Madison, and worked nights stocking shelves at the grocery store down the block. At first he seemed harmless enough, just another neighbor who'd nod in the hallway or hold the door if you were carrying groceries. But sometime around mid-July, things started to shift in a way that made my skin crawl. He began showing up wherever I was in the building, by the mailboxes when I checked the mail, in the laundry room when I did our clothes, even hanging around the lobby when I'd come home from work. The gifts started appearing at our door on a Tuesday morning, a wilted bouquet of carnations wrapped in cellophane from the gas station. No note attached, but I knew who they were from. Mom thought maybe they were for her from a secret admirer at work, which would have been funny if it wasn't so unsettling. 2 days later, there was a teddy bear holding a heart that said, "Be mine," even though it was August and nowhere near Valentine's Day. Then came the jewelry box with fake pearl earrings, left right on our doormat while we slept. Each time I tried to return them, sliding them under the Hoffman's door on the 6th floor, they'd reappear at hours within hours. Mrs. Hoffman always acted confused when I mentioned it, saying Blake was hardly ever home and wouldn't do something like that. The watching got worse after I started leaving the gifts at their door. I'd catch glimpses of him everywhere, standing in the parking lot when I looked out our kitchen window, sitting on the bench across from the yogurt shop during my shifts, following 3 steps behind when I walked to the corner store. He never said anything directly, just maintained this presence that made me want to crawl out of my own skin. I told Mom about it, and she said to be careful but that maybe I was misreading things. After all, Blake had always been polite to her, helped carry her groceries once. But mothers don't always see what their daughters see, especially when it comes to men who know exactly how to appear helpful and harmless to anyone who isn't their target. Everything came to a head on August 18th. I remember the date because it was Tyler's 13th birthday, and we'd just finished his small party with a few friends from summer camp. Mom had worked a double shift to afford the PlayStation game he wanted, and she'd crashed early, exhausted. Around 9:30, I gathered up all the paper plates and pizza boxes to take to the dumpster behind our building. It was one of those thick, humid nights where the air feels like soup, and the streetlights were fighting through a haze of mosquitoes. I remember thinking how quiet the alley was, just the distant hum of traffic on Wisconsin Avenue, and someone's TV playing too loud through an open window. The dumpster area was poorly lit, just one flickering bulb that the landlord kept promising to fix but never did. The space between the dumpster and the brick wall created this narrow corridor that always gave me the creeps, but I'd done this hundreds of times before. I lifted the lid, tossed in the first bag and was reaching for the second when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. Before I could turn around, a hand clamped over my mouth and an arm wrapped around my waist, yanking me backward into that dark space between the dumpster and the wall. The smell hit me immediately, stale cigarettes and that same cologne I'd noticed in the elevator, sharp and cheap, like something from the dollar store. "Finally got you alone," Blake whispered, his breath hot against my ear as he dragged me deeper into the shadows. My feet scraped against the concrete as I tried to dig my heels in, but he was stronger than his skinny frame suggested. The panic hit me in waves, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst, my lungs burning as I tried to scream through his palm pressed against my mouth. He kept muttering things, crazy things about how I'd been playing hard to get, how I'd embarrassed him in front of his parents, how he'd been patient but was done waiting. His grip tightened as he pushed me against the wall, and I could feel the rough brick catching on my shirt, scratching my back. That's when survival instinct kicked in. I bit down hard on his palm and threw my elbow back into his ribs with everything I had. He cursed and loosened his grip just enough for me to scream. Not a word, just this raw, primal sound that tore out of my throat. Then came the miracle. Headlights swept across the alley entrance, and I heard a car door slam. "Hey, what's going on back there?" A man's voice, urgent and commanding. Blake tried to pull me further into the darkness, but the delivery driver was already running toward us, his phone flashlight cutting through the shadows. He was huge, probably 6'4", built like a linebacker, wearing a neon yellow Papa John's shirt that seemed to glow in the darkness. Blake released me so suddenly I stumbled forward, my legs like jelly. "She's my girlfriend, we're just talking," Blake said, his voice shifting to something casual and friendly. But the driver wasn't buying it. "That's not what it looked like," the driver said, keeping his light trained on Blake while pulling out his phone with his other hand. "Miss, are you okay? Do you need help?" I couldn't form words, just nodded frantically while stumbling toward him, putting distance between myself and Blake. The driver, Jerome, I later learned, positioned himself between us like a wall, already dialing 911. Blake's whole demeanor changed then, from predator to victim in seconds. "This is a misunderstanding, man. We live in the same building. Ask anyone." But Jerome kept his eyes on Blake, describing our location to the dispatcher in calm, clear detail. Within minutes, sirens echoed off the buildings, and 2 squad cars pulled into the alley, their lights painting everything in alternating red and blue. The police separated us immediately, one officer taking me to a squad car while 2 others dealt with Blake. I sat in the back seat, not as a suspect but for privacy, while a female officer named Danielle Washington took my statement. The words tumbled out in fragments, the gifts, the stalking, the attack, how scared I'd been. She wrote everything down, her face growing harder with each detail. Through the window, I watched Blake gesturing wildly, probably spinning his story about misunderstandings and crazy teenage girls. But then Officer Washington showed me something that changed everything. Blake's wallet had fallen during the struggle, and inside they'd found pictures of me. Dozens of them taken from distances, some through my bedroom window, others at work, even one of me sleeping on the bus. My stomach churned as I recognized backgrounds from the past month, realizing he'd been documenting my life without my knowledge. They arrested Blake that night, charging him with assault, stalking, and attempted kidnapping. Mom came down in her pajamas, Tyler trailing behind her, both of their faces pale with shock. Jerome stayed to give his statement, and I thanked him probably 50 times before he left. Turns out he'd been delivering to our building and decided to park in the alley instead of double parking on the street like usual. "Pure chance," he said, but I prefer to think of it as fate. The next few days blurred together, filing restraining orders, talking to detectives, learning that Blake had a similar incident at his college that had been quietly handled by his wealthy parents. But the worst part came after his family posted bail. Suddenly, we were the villains in their story. Mrs. Hoffman cornered my mom in the lobby, screaming about how I'd ruined her son's life, how I'd led him on, and was now playing victim for attention. The harassment from the Hoffman family escalated quickly. Dead rats appeared on our doorstep, our car tires were slashed twice, and someone spray-painted "liar" across our door while we slept. Other tenants started avoiding us, not wanting to get involved in the drama. The final straw came when Tyler found a note in his backpack after school that said, "Your sister destroyed my family. Watch your back." That night, Mom made the decision. We were leaving. Within 2 weeks, we'd packed everything and moved 40 miles north to Sheboygan, where Mom's cousin helped us find a new place. Blake eventually took a plea deal, 2 years in prison, 5 years probation, and a permanent restraining order. But even now, 5 years later, I still check behind dumpsters before throwing out trash, still feel my chest tighten when I smell that dollar store cologne, still look for exits whenever I enter a new space. Some lessons you learn through fear become part of your DNA, survival instincts earned through moments you wish you could forget. That first morning on Oak Ridge Street, I stood in our new kitchen drinking instant coffee from a paper cup, while Melissa unpacked boxes in the living room. I was 43, she was 41, and we'd just bought our first house together after 15 years of marriage. The place needed work, peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, a furnace that sounded like it was dying, but it was ours. Melissa had gotten promoted to head nurse at Riverside General, and my consulting business was finally stable enough to qualify for a mortgage. We'd closed on the house 3 days earlier, a brick colonial at 4327 Oak Ridge that had been on the market for 8 months. The realtor mentioned something about difficult neighbors, but we figured she meant the usual suburban complaints about lawn height or parking. If only we'd asked more questions. Our first hint that something was wrong came around noon when I was hauling a bookshelf up the front steps. An elderly man appeared at the edge of our driveway, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt despite the June heat. He had this peculiar way of standing, perfectly straight like he was still in the military, with pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, extending a hand. "Harold Brennan, 4325. His handshake was firm, almost aggressive, and he held on a second too long while studying my face. "Hope you folks are reasonable people." The last owners weren't. Before I could ask what he meant, he glanced at the house to our right, 4329, and his jaw tightened. "Just remember, property lines exist for a reason. That maple tree drops leaves in my yard every fall, and I expect them cleaned up. The Kowalskis never understood that simple courtesy." He turned and walked back to his house without waiting for a response, leaving me standing there with the bookshelf half-balanced on the steps. Later that afternoon, while I was connecting the washer in the basement, Melissa called me upstairs. "Honey, you need to see this," she said, standing at the dining room window. Outside, Harold was measuring something along the property line with an actual surveyor's wheel, making notes in a small notebook. On the other side of the fence, an elderly woman watched him from her porch at 4329. She had wild silver hair pulled back in a loose bun and wore a flowing purple caftan that made her look like an aging hippie. Even from inside our house, I could see the disgust on her face. "That's been going on for 20 minutes, Melissa whispered. "He's measured the same spot 4 times. As we watched, the woman, who I'd later learn was Eleanor Kowalski, stood up and shouted something. Harold didn't acknowledge her, just kept rolling his wheel along the fence line. Eleanor threw her hands up and stormed inside, slamming her door hard enough that we felt it. That evening, we were eating Chinese takeout on the living room floor when Eleanor knocked on our door. Up close, she was smaller than she'd appeared from the window, maybe 5'2", with deep laugh lines and paint stains under her fingernails. "I'm Eleanor from next door," she said, handing us a homemade apple pie. "Wanted to welcome you properly before that lunatic poisoned the well." She had this raspy voice, like she'd smoked for decades, and her eyes kept darting toward Harold's house. "Listen, I don't want to scare you off, but you should know what you've moved into. That man has been harassing me for 11 years over that maple tree. 11 years. Says the roots are damaging his precious lawn, the leaves are killing his grass, the branches are a liability." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He's taken me to court 3 times. 3 times. Lost every case because the tree is on my property, planted by my late husband in 1987. But Harold doesn't accept defeat. He measures, he documents, he calls the city inspector every month." She paused, gripping the door frame. "Just last week I caught him pouring something on the roots at night. probably herbicide. Over the next few weeks, we tried to stay neutral while renovating our kitchen. But it was impossible to ignore the daily drama unfolding on either side of us. Harold had security cameras pointed directly at the maple tree, and Eleanor had installed her own cameras aimed at Harold's yard. They'd stand at their respective fences at the same time each morning, pretending to tend their gardens while obviously monitoring each other. Harold would photograph every leaf that fell on his side, placing little yellow evidence markers next to them like it was a crime scene. Eleanor would blast classical music from her porch speakers whenever Harold was outside, cranking the volume until he retreated indoors. Once, I saw Harold measuring the shadow the tree cast on his lawn at different times of day, creating charts and graphs on his laptop. Another time, Eleanor accidentally overwatered her garden, sending a stream of muddy water flowing under the fence into Harold's meticulously maintained yard. The man actually came out with towels to soak it up, muttering about property damage and documenting everything with his phone. The situation reached a new level of absurdity in early July when I came home to find a crowd gathered on the sidewalk. Harold had hired a tree specialist, complete with a van labeled Peterson's Arboreal Forensics, to examine the maple from his side of the fence. The specialist had fancy equipment, taking core samples from the trunk and using some kind of radar device on the roots. Eleanor stood on her porch with her arms crossed, shouting that this was harassment, and she'd already called her lawyer. "That tree is perfectly healthy," she yelled. "You're just bitter because Judge Coleman laughed you out of court." Harold ignored her, discussing something intently with the specialist while pointing at various branches. The other neighbors watched like it was free entertainment, some openly taking videos. Melissa pulled into the driveway and looked at me through the car window with an expression that said, "What have we done?" That night, we seriously discussed whether we'd made a mistake buying the house, but we'd sunk everything into the down payment. We were stuck. Everything changed on July 18th when Eleanor received an official-looking envelope. I was replacing our mailbox post when the mail carrier arrived, and I saw Eleanor's face go white as she read the return address. She ripped it open right there on her porch, and then let out a scream that made me drop my hammer. "He's suing me again!" she shrieked, waving the papers in the air. "That bastard is taking me back to court!" She stormed down her steps and marched straight to Harold's fence, pounding on it with her fists. "You pathetic little man. You lost 3 times, 3 times. What makes you think this will be different?" Harold emerged from his garage, calm as ever, holding a clipboard. "New evidence," he said simply. "The arborist found fungal decay in the heartwood. That tree is a hazard, Eleanor. When it falls and crushes my greenhouse, you'll be liable for damages." Eleanor's face turned purple. "That tree will outlive us both." She spat on the ground near his fence, then noticed me watching and pointed a shaking finger. "You're a witness. Remember this harassment." She stormed back inside, and I heard dishes breaking. The court date was set for July 30th, and the entire street held its breath during those 12 days. Eleanor hired 3 different arborists who all declared the tree healthy, posting their reports on telephone poles like wanted posters. Harold countered by installing motion sensor floodlights that would illuminate the tree whenever anything moved near it, turning Eleanor's backyard into a prison searchlight scenario every time a cat walked by. He also started a petition, going door to door asking neighbors to sign a statement about the tree being a public nuisance. Most people refused, but a few signed just to get him off their porches. Eleanor retaliated by hosting loud garden parties every evening, inviting friends who would all park directly in front of Harold's house. During one party, someone, Eleanor swore it wasn't her, spray-painted "tree killer" on the sidewalk in front of Harold's driveway. He spent hours scrubbing it off with a pressure washer, photographing every angle for evidence. Melissa and I started parking in our garage and using our back door exclusively, avoiding any chance of being drawn into conversations with either of them. The morning of July 30th arrived with an oppressive heat that made the air shimmer. Harold left his house at 7 a.m. sharp, wearing a full suit despite the temperature already hitting 85 degrees. He loaded 3 banker's boxes of documents into his sedan, each one meticulously labeled. Eleanor emerged an hour later in a floral dress, accompanied by a younger woman who looked like her daughter. They climbed into a beat-up Toyota Corolla, Eleanor clutching a tattered folder against her chest. Both cars pulled away within minutes of each other, leaving the street eerily quiet. Melissa had an early shift at the hospital, so I was alone, trying to focus on installing new cabinet hardware while anxiously checking my phone for any neighborhood gossip about the trial. Around 2 p.m., cars started returning to the street. First came Eleanor's daughter's Toyota, driving slowly, then Harold's sedan, moving even slower. Neither Eleanor nor Harold got out immediately. They just sat in their respective driveways, engines off, neither moving. From my kitchen window, I could see Harold still gripping his steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Eleanor was slumped in the passenger seat, her folder nowhere to be seen. Finally, around 2:30, Harold emerged from his car. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt untucked, and his perfect posture had crumbled into something defeated. He walked to his front door like a man in a trance, fumbling with his keys. Eleanor got out next, but instead of the fury I expected, she moved with quiet exhaustion. Her daughter tried to take her arm, but Eleanor waved her off and walked to her porch alone. For the first time since we'd moved in, neither of them looked at the other's property. The street felt like it was holding its breath. That evening, Melissa got home and found me still watching from the kitchen window. "What happened?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "They both came back from court and just deflated." We ordered pizza and ate on our back deck, trying to enjoy the cooler evening air. Around 9 p.m., we heard Harold's back door open. Through the gaps in our fence, we could see him dragging something heavy across his patio. It was a metal gas can, the red kind you'd use for a lawnmower. He set it down near his garden shed and went back inside. Melissa and I exchanged glances but said nothing. Maybe he was just organizing his garage. The next morning, July 31st, I woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of our doorbell ringing frantically. Melissa bolted up right beside me and we both stumbled downstairs in our pajamas. Through the peephole, I saw Eleanor's daughter, still in a nightgown and sneakers, her face streaked with tears. "Please," she gasped when I opened the door. "Call 911. Something terrible has happened." Behind her, I could see smoke rising from Harold's backyard and an orange glow flickering against the pre-dawn sky. The maple tree was on fire. Flames climbed up its trunk like golden snakes, consuming the leaves with a crackling roar that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning. But that wasn't the worst part. Harold was standing in his backyard, still in yesterday's clothes, holding a rifle. He wasn't pointing it at anyone, just cradling it against his chest while watching the tree burn. Eleanor stood frozen on her porch, one hand pressed against her mouth. The smell of gasoline mixed with burning wood filled the air, making my eyes water. Melissa was already on the phone with 911, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. What happened next is burned into my memory like a scar that won't fade. As sirens wailed in the distance, Harold slowly raised the rifle. For a moment, I thought he was going to shoot the tree, some final act of destruction. But then he turned toward Eleanor's house. She must have seen it too, because she started backing toward her door, her purple caftan billowing around her. "Harold, no," she said, her raspy voice carrying across the yards. "It's just a tree. It's just a goddamn tree." Harold's face was completely blank, like he wasn't even there anymore. The fire crackled behind him, throwing wild shadows across the lawn. He took 3 measured steps toward the property line, the rifle now pointed directly at Eleanor. She turned to run, but her slipper caught on the porch step. The gunshot was so loud it felt like it split the morning in half. Eleanor crumpled onto her porch, and her daughter's scream merged with the approaching sirens. Harold stood there for another moment, then turned the rifle on himself before anyone could stop him. I pulled Melissa back inside and slammed the door, but we could still hear everything, the sirens, the shouting, the tree continuing to burn as if nothing had happened. The police and paramedics swarmed Oak Ridge Street within minutes, but it was too late for both of them. They covered Harold's body with a yellow tarp right there in his perfectly manicured yard. while EMTs worked frantically on Eleanor before carrying her away. Her daughter rode in the ambulance, but I heard later that Eleanor was pronounced dead at the hospital. The fire department put out the burning maple tree, leaving behind a blackened skeleton that somehow looked even more tragic than the bodies. Melissa and I spent hours giving statements to different officers, repeating the same details over and over. Harold had lost the court case, they told us. The judge had not only ruled in Eleanor's favor again, but had issued a restraining order preventing Harold from any further legal action regarding the tree. He'd also been ordered to pay Eleanor's legal fees, nearly $40,000. The young officer taking my statement shook his head. "All this over a tree," he kept saying. 20 years on the force, and it's always the small stuff that makes people snap. We stayed with Melissa's sister for a week after that, unable to sleep in our house with the crime scene tape still visible from our windows. When we finally returned, the neighborhood felt different, haunted. Eleanor's daughter had the maple tree cut down and the stump ground out, leaving just a patch of fresh dirt where it had stood for 36 years. Harold's house went up for sale immediately, his estranged son from California handling everything remotely. New families moved in eventually. A young couple with twins bought Harold's place, and Eleanor's daughter sold to a retired teacher who planted roses where the maple had been. They had no idea what had happened, and those of us who knew didn't tell them. Melissa and I finished our renovations and still live at 4327 Oak Ridge, but we've never forgotten that morning. Sometimes when I'm up early and the light is just right, I can still see the shadow where that tree used to stand, stretching across both yards like it's trying to connect them. We keep to ourselves mostly, smile and wave at the neighbors, but never get too involved. Because now we know that beneath the suburban politeness, the trimmed hedges and property lines, people can carry grudges that grow like roots underground, spreading and deepening until something terrible blooms. Night shifts at St. Mary's Hospital had become my normal routine by the time I turned 28. The ICU needed experienced nurses during those long, dark hours when most of the world slept, and the pay differential made it worth adjusting my entire life around a backward schedule. I'd been living in apartment 2B at Brookfield Manor for about 3 years, a modest complex with paper-thin walls and a landlord who treated maintenance requests like polite suggestions. The building attracted mostly working-class tenants, a retired history teacher, some college students cramming for exams, and a handful of single professionals like myself who valued the affordable rent more than luxury amenities. My days were spent sleeping until mid-afternoon, then grabbing coffee and preparing for another 12-hour shift that would end just as the sun was rising. The woman in 2A had always been pleasant enough, though we rarely spoke beyond the occasional hallway greeting. Janet was probably in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair that she always kept neatly styled, and a wardrobe that suggested she worked somewhere professional, maybe an office job or bank teller position. She had this soft way of speaking that made you lean in slightly to catch her words, and her smile was genuine, but reserved, like someone who'd learned to be careful with how much of herself she revealed. Our apartments shared a wall, and I'd grown accustomed to the predictable sounds of her daily routine. The morning shower around 7, the coffee maker gurgling to life, the muffled sound of her television during dinner. She kept her life quiet and orderly, which I appreciated given my need to sleep during daylight hours. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of her through my peephole, always alone, always moving with purpose through the hallway. Everything changed sometime in late September, when a man started appearing at her door. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that looked like it hadn't seen a proper cut in months, and clothes that seemed permanently wrinkled. The first time I saw him, he was leaning against Janet's doorframe while she fumbled with her keys, and there was an intensity in how he watched her movements that made me pause at my own door. His voice carried through the thin walls, deeper and more commanding than Janet's gentle tone, though I couldn't make out specific words. Within a week, it became clear he wasn't just visiting anymore. I'd hear his heavy footsteps at odd hours, the sound of furniture being moved around, and the distinct thud of work boots being kicked off near the entrance. Janet's routine began to shift, becoming less predictable, and I noticed she started leaving for work earlier and returning later. The argument started small, probably sometime in early October. At first, they were just slightly elevated conversations that would filter through our shared wall during my afternoon sleep. I'd wake up to the sound of his voice rising above her quieter responses, though the words remained indistinct. Janet's television habits changed too. Instead of her usual evening programs, I'd hear it playing much louder than before, as if she was trying to drown out tension in the room. The man's presence became more oppressive somehow, his footsteps heavier, his voice carrying a sharp edge that hadn't been there initially. I remember lying in bed one afternoon, trying to fall asleep for my upcoming shift, when I heard what sounded like a door slamming hard enough to rattle the picture frames on my wall. The silence that followed was somehow more unsettling than the noise itself, thick and uncomfortable, in a way that made me turn up my own television volume. By mid-October, the disturbances had escalated into full-blown shouting matches that would erupt without warning. His voice would boom through the walls with a viciousness that made my chest tighten, while Janet's responses became increasingly muffled and desperate. I'd catch fragments of his words, accusations about money, demands about where she'd been, cruel comments about her appearance or intelligence. The worst incidents always seemed to happen around 2 in the morning, right when I'd be getting ready for work. I'd stand in my kitchen, coffee mug in hand, listening to furniture scraping against the floor and what sounded like objects being thrown. Janet's voice would disappear entirely during these episodes, leaving only his angry monologue echoing through the thin drywall. The building's other tenants had to be hearing this too, but nobody ever mentioned it during our brief hallway encounters. We all just pretended it wasn't happening, avoiding eye contact and walking a little faster past apartment 2A. The physical violence became undeniable sometime in November. I'd be lying in bed, trying to sleep before my shift, when I'd hear the unmistakable sound of bodies colliding with walls. The impact would shake our shared wall so hard that my bedside lamp would tremble, followed by Janet's voice pleading in a tone that made my stomach clench. There would be crashes, picture frames falling, dishes breaking, furniture being overturned. His voice would become animalistic during these moments, reduced to growls and threats that I couldn't fully understand but somehow felt in my bones. I remember one particular night when the violence was so intense that I actually got up and walked to my front door, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. But I hesitated, telling myself it wasn't my business, that maybe I was misunderstanding what I was hearing. The silence that followed these incidents was always deafening, lasting for hours, and I'd find myself lying awake wondering if Janet was even still conscious next door. Janet's appearance began to change in ways that should have been impossible to ignore. When I'd catch glimpses of her in the hallway, she'd be wearing long sleeves even on warm days, and her makeup seemed heavier, more deliberate around her eyes and cheeks. She moved differently too, more carefully, as if every step caused pain. Her friendly nods became quick, nervous glances, and she'd fumble with her keys at her door like her fingers weren't working properly. The sweet, soft-spoken woman I'd known was disappearing, replaced by someone who seemed to be shrinking into herself. I noticed she'd started taking different routes through the building, using the back stairs instead of the main entrance, probably to avoid running into other tenants. The few times we did cross paths, she'd offer that same reserved smile, but now it looked strained, practiced, like she was wearing a mask that didn't quite fit her face anymore. The night everything changed started like any other shift at the hospital. I'd arrived at 11 p.m., grabbed my assignment sheet, and settled into the familiar rhythm of checking on patients and updating charts. Around 3 a.m. during my usual rounds, I was adjusting an IV drip for an elderly patient when I realized how quiet the ICU was that night, unusually peaceful for a place that typically buzzed with activity. I remember thinking about Janet as I walked back to the nurse's station, wondering if she and her boyfriend were having another one of their explosive fights while I was safely away at work. The thought made me feel guilty and relieved at the same time, like I was somehow betraying her by not being there to witness what was happening. I poured myself another cup of coffee and tried to focus on my work, but part of me couldn't shake the image of Janet's frightened face from our last hallway encounter. I told myself I'd try to talk to her when I got home, maybe find a way to offer help without being too intrusive. The drive home at 7 a.m. was routine, the same route I'd taken hundreds of times before, past the convenience store where I'd sometimes grab breakfast, through the intersection where the traffic light always seemed to catch me. I was thinking about stopping for groceries later that afternoon when I turned into the parking lot of Brookfield Manor and saw them. 3 police cars, an ambulance, and what looked like a coroner's van were scattered across the usually empty lot, like some kind of emergency response training exercise. My first instinct was to assume it was the retired teacher in 1C. Mr. Peterson had been having health issues lately and lived alone. I parked in my usual spot and walked toward the building entrance, expecting to see paramedics wheeling out an elderly man on a stretcher. Instead, I saw Detective Martinez from the local precinct talking to our landlord near the main entrance, both of them looking grim in the early morning light. The detective was taking notes in a small leather notebook, and our landlord kept shaking his head like he was trying to deny whatever he was being told. The reality hit me when I saw them wheeling the gurney out of the building. The shape under the white sheet was too small to be Mr. Peterson, and the way the officers were handling the scene, with that careful, reverent silence that comes with violent death, told me this wasn't a natural passing. My legs felt weak as I watched them load the gurney into the coroner's van, and I found myself counting the windows on the second floor, trying to figure out which apartment they'd come from. When Detective Martinez approached me, his expression was professional but tired, like he'd been working this case for hours already. He introduced himself and asked if I lived in the building, then pulled out his notebook again when I told him I was in 2B. His next question made my world tilt sideways. "Did you know your neighbor Janet Morrison well?" The use of past tense sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cool morning air, and I realized I'd been holding my breath since I first saw the emergency vehicles. Detective Martinez explained that Janet had been found dead in her apartment around 5 a.m. when her boyfriend called 911, claiming he'd discovered her body when he came home from work. The detective's tone was carefully neutral, but I could hear the skepticism underneath as he described the scene. Janet had suffered severe head trauma, and the apartment showed signs of a violent struggle: overturned furniture, broken dishes, blood on the walls. The boyfriend, whose name was Kevin Hartley, was being questioned downtown, though he hadn't been officially arrested yet. As the detective spoke, I felt a crushing weight settle on my chest, realizing that every sound I'd heard through those thin walls had been real, that Janet had been dying slowly while I convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to intervene. The detective asked if I'd heard anything unusual the night before, and I had to tell him honestly that I'd been at work, that I'd heard nothing because I wasn't there when she needed someone, anyone, to hear her final moments. The guilt that followed Janet's death consumed me in ways I hadn't expected. I couldn't sleep in my own apartment anymore, couldn't walk past her door without seeing her face in my mind, couldn't stop thinking about all the times I'd heard her being hurt and chosen to turn up my television instead of calling for help. The detective called me a few days later to inform me that Kevin Hartley had been charged with second-degree murder after his story fell apart under questioning. Apparently, he'd been unemployed for months and had been at the apartment all night, contradicting his initial claim about being at work. The coroner determined that Janet had died sometime between midnight and 3 a.m., hours during which I'd been safely at the hospital, completely unaware that my neighbor was fighting for her life, just feet away from my empty bedroom. I eventually requested a transfer to day shifts and moved to a different apartment across town, but I still wake up sometimes thinking I can hear her voice calling for help through walls that are no longer there. College was supposed to be the best years of my life, or at least that's what everyone kept telling me. I was a junior at State University in Ohio, studying communications and barely scraping by on a combination of student loans and my part-time job at the campus bookstore. The apartment complex I lived in wasn't exactly luxury living. Thin walls, flickering hallway lights, and a landlord who seemed to think maintenance was just a suggestion. But it was cheap, and for a broke college kid like me, that was all that mattered. I'd been living in apartment 3B for about 8 months when I first noticed the man across the hall. He was probably in his early 30s, average height, with sandy brown hair that always looked freshly combed and these pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. What struck me most was his smile, not because it was particularly warm or friendly, but because it never seemed to leave his face. The first time we actually crossed paths was on a Tuesday morning in October 2022. I was rushing out to my 8 a.m. psychology class, fumbling with my keys and trying to balance my coffee and backpack, when I heard his door open. "Good morning," he said, and when I turned around, there he was, perfectly dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt, that constant smile stretching across his face like it had been painted on. I mumbled something back about it being a good morning and hurried toward the stairs, but I could feel his eyes following me the entire way down the hall. There was something about the way he stood there, perfectly still in his doorway, watching me leave, that made my skin crawl just a little bit. Over the next few weeks, this became our routine, him appearing in his doorway whenever I came or went, always with that same greeting, always with that same unnerving smile. He never offered his name, never tried to make small talk beyond those 2 words, and I started to realize I'd never actually heard him speak to anyone else in the building. What really started to bother me wasn't just his strange behavior, but the timing of it all. No matter what time I left my apartment, whether it was 6 a.m. for an early shift at the bookstore or 11 p.m. coming back from the library, he somehow always seemed to know. I'd hear the soft click of his deadbolt turning just as I stepped into the hallway, and there he'd be, emerging from 3C like he'd been waiting right behind the door. My roommate Jake thought I was being paranoid when I mentioned it to him one night over pizza. "Maybe the dude just has really good hearing," he said, not looking up from his economics textbook. But Jake didn't live on the 3rd floor. He didn't see the way the man's eyes would linger on me, or how he'd stand there for a full minute after I'd already turned the corner, just watching the empty space where I'd been. I started timing my exits differently, trying to catch him off guard, but it never worked. He was always there, always smiling, always watching. The smell started sometime in November, right around finals week when stress was already making everyone in the building a little on edge. At first, I thought maybe someone had left garbage in the hallway or that there was a problem with the building's ancient plumbing. It was a sweet, cloying odor that seemed to hang in the air near his door, getting stronger as the days went by. I mentioned it to Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived in 3A, when I ran into her checking her mail. She wrinkled her nose and nodded knowingly. "I smell it too," she whispered, glancing nervously toward 3C. "Smells like something died in there." The way she said it, with such certainty, made my stomach turn. I started taking the stairs 2 at a time when I passed his door, holding my breath until I reached the safety of my own apartment. But even with my door locked and my windows open, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong just 20 feet across the hall. The man's behavior started getting even stranger around the same time the smell appeared. Instead of just appearing in his doorway for our usual morning encounters, I began catching glimpses of him at odd hours through my peephole. He'd be standing in the hallway at 2 a.m. just staring at the wall, or I'd see him wheeling a large black suitcase toward the elevator at 3 in the morning. The suitcase looked heavy, really heavy, and the way he struggled with it made me wonder what the hell he was moving around in the middle of the night. One Thursday evening, I was coming home from my shift at the bookstore when I saw him mopping the hallway floor outside his apartment. The entire area was soaked with what looked like bleach, and he was scrubbing so vigorously that the muscles in his arms were straining against his shirt. When he saw me, that smile appeared again, but this time it seemed forced, like he was trying too hard to appear normal. "Spring cleaning," he said, even though it was nearly December. I just nodded and hurried past, but I could smell the bleach for hours afterward, mixing with that underlying stench in a way that made my head pound. His attempts at conversation became more frequent and increasingly unsettling. Instead of just his usual "good morning," he started asking questions that felt too personal, too invasive. "You're studying communications, right?" he said one day, which immediately put me on edge because I'd never told him my major. "Do you have any classes with Professor Williams? She's really pretty." The way he said pretty made my skin crawl. There was something hungry about it, something that made me want to run back into my apartment and lock the door. Another time he asked if I had a girlfriend, and when I said yes, he tilted his head and said, "She must be special. I bet she's got beautiful hair." I started lying about having a girlfriend just to avoid those conversations, but it didn't seem to matter. He'd find new ways to make me uncomfortable, asking about my schedule, my friends, my family back home. I began leaving earlier and coming home later, trying to avoid him altogether. But somehow he always seemed to know when I was around. The breaking point came on a Friday night in early December. I'd been out late studying at the library with some classmates, and I didn't get home until almost midnight. The hallway was darker than usual. One of the fluorescent lights had burned out, and the smell was so strong that it hit me like a physical wall the moment I stepped off the elevator. I was fumbling with my keys, trying to get into my apartment as quickly as possible, when I heard his door creak open behind me. "Working late again?" he said, and his voice sounded different somehow, rougher, more excited. When I turned around, he was standing there in the doorway, but this time he wasn't wearing his usual neat clothes. His shirt was wrinkled and stained with something dark, and his hair was disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. The worst part was his eyes. They were wide and bright, almost manic, like he was high on something. "I've been waiting for you," he said, taking a step closer. "I have something I want to show you." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from him, but my keys were still tangled in my fingers and my apartment door felt impossibly far away. "Maybe another time," I managed to say, finally getting my key into the lock. But he kept talking, his voice getting more animated with each word. "She's really beautiful," he said, and I could hear him moving closer behind me. "I think you'd like her. She's got the most amazing eyes. So blue, so clear. They're still so clear." The way he said "still" made something cold settle in my chest, and I practically threw myself through my door the second it opened. I slammed it shut behind me and immediately turned all 3 locks, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Through the peephole, I could see him standing in the hallway for another 10 minutes, just staring at my door with that horrible smile on his face. That night, I called my parents and told them I was thinking about transferring schools, but I couldn't explain why without sounding completely insane. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of sirens. At first, I thought it was just another ambulance heading to the hospital down the street, but the sound kept getting closer and closer until it seemed like it was right outside my building. I looked out my window and saw 3 police cars parked in the lot, their red and blue lights flashing against the gray December sky. My phone was buzzing with texts from other residents asking if anyone knew what was happening, but nobody seemed to have any real information. I threw on some clothes and crept out into the hallway, where I found Mrs. Chen standing by her door in her bathrobe, clutching a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "They went into 3C, she whispered when she saw me. "About 20 minutes ago. They had masks on their faces and everything." We stood there together, watching as more officers arrived, including some in plain clothes who looked like detectives. The smell in the hallway was overwhelming now, so strong that one of the officers actually gagged and had to step back outside for fresh air. What happened next is burned into my memory forever. The door to 3C opened, and 2 officers emerged, both looking pale and shaken. One of them was talking rapidly into his radio, using words like deceased and decomposition, and immediate backup. Behind them came a detective, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair who looked like she'd seen everything there was to see in her career. But even she looked disturbed as she surveyed the hallway, her eyes lingering on the spot where I'd seen him mopping with bleach just a few weeks earlier. "We need to evacuate this floor," she said to the officers, her voice crisp and professional, "and get the coroner down here immediately." That's when I realized what the smell had been all along, and why he'd been so strange, so excited, so eager to show me something beautiful with clear blue eyes. Mrs. Chen grabbed my arm so tightly I thought she might leave bruises, and we both backed away toward the stairs as more people in hazmat suits began filing into the building. The detective noticed us watching and approached, her expression grim. "Did either of you know the occupant of 3C?" she asked, and when we both shook our heads, she seemed relieved. "Good. We're going to need to talk to everyone on this floor, but first we need to get you somewhere safe." The full story came out over the next few days through news reports and police interviews. The man in 3C, whose name turned out to be Robert Grimsby, had been keeping the body of a missing woman named Ashley Thompson in his apartment for almost 3 weeks. She'd been a student at the community college across town, just 22 years old, with long blonde hair and those clear blue eyes he'd been so excited to tell me about. The police said she'd probably been dead since mid-November, right around the time the smell started. They found evidence that he'd been interacting with her body, talking to it, treating it like she was still alive. The detective told me later that he'd been planning to move her somewhere else. That's what the suitcase had been for. But he'd gotten too comfortable, too confident that nobody would figure it out. What haunts me most is that I was supposed to be his backup plan. They found a notebook in his apartment filled with detailed observations about my schedule, my routines, even sketches of what I looked like from different angles. The last entry, dated the night before the police arrived, simply said, "If something happens to Ashley, the boy across the hall would be perfect. Same eyes, same build. He trusts me." I moved out of that building the next week and never looked back, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, wondering what would have happened if I'd accepted his invitation to see something beautiful that Friday night in December. I never thought I'd be the type of person to post something like this online, but I need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me for weeks now. My name is Michael. I'm a 34-year-old accountant living in a quiet neighborhood in Phoenix with my wife, Amanda. We've been married for 6 years, and up until recently, our biggest worry was whether we could afford to renovate the bathroom this year. I work from home 3 days a week. Amanda teaches 3rd grade at the local elementary school, and we have this modest 2-story house with a decent backyard where we like to grill on weekends. Normal suburban life, the kind where you wave at your neighbors and complain about HOA fees. We moved to Maple Street about 4 years ago specifically because it felt safe and family-friendly. Kids riding bikes, people walking their dogs, that whole American dream thing. Everything was peaceful until we started having issues with Vincent. Our next-door neighbor, Vincent, is this guy who's probably in his late 50s, lives alone, and has always been a bit intense. Not in an obviously dangerous way at first, just one of those people who takes everything way too seriously. He's got this perfectly manicured lawn that he treats like it's some kind of sacred ground, and he's always outside doing yard work in these crisp khaki pants and polo shirts, even when it's 110 degrees. The guy has this weird obsession with property lines and rules. He actually measured the exact distance between our houses once and told us our garden hose was encroaching on his side by 2 inches. Amanda and I used to joke about him being the neighborhood watch committee of one. We had no idea how bad things were about to get. The first real sign of trouble started about 8 months ago, when Amanda took a shortcut through our backyard to get to the mailbox, and apparently stepped on a tiny corner of his grass. Vincent came marching over that same evening, red-faced and practically vibrating with anger. He started yelling about trespassing and property damage, like Amanda had driven a truck through his roses instead of stepping on some grass. Amanda tried to apologize, but he kept interrupting her, getting louder and more aggressive. I remember watching from our kitchen window as he jabbed his finger in her direction, his voice carrying across the whole neighborhood. The guy was completely unhinged about something so trivial. That night, he actually left a printed letter in our mailbox, not handwritten but typed out on his computer, detailing the boundaries of his property and threatening to call the police if we violated his space again. Amanda was rattled by the whole thing, and honestly, so was I. We'd never dealt with someone who escalated so quickly over nothing, but we figured he'd calm down and we'd all move on. The next few weeks were tense but manageable. Vincent would stare at us whenever we were outside, and he started putting up these little orange flags along the property line like we were construction workers who couldn't figure out where his yard ended. He also installed this motion-activated spotlight that would blast our bedroom window every time a cat walked by. Amanda started avoiding that side of the yard entirely, and I found myself checking to make sure he wasn't watching before I went outside to grab the mail. The guy had this way of making you feel like you were always doing something wrong, even when you were just living your life. Then one evening in March, our dog Buddy, he's this sweet old golden retriever, squeezed through a gap in our fence and wandered into Vincent's yard. I saw it happen from the kitchen and immediately went to get him, but Vincent was already outside, screaming at the top of his lungs about property invasion and unleashed animals. The whole thing lasted maybe 30 seconds, but he acted like Buddy had destroyed his entire lawn. That incident was the turning point. Vincent started what I can only describe as a campaign of harassment. He'd blast music at exactly 7 a.m. on weekends, right when Amanda and I were trying to sleep in. He'd run his leaf blower for hours, creating clouds of dust that would drift into our yard when we had laundry hanging outside. The worst part was how he'd time these activities, always when we were trying to relax or have friends over. One Saturday, we were having a barbecue with Amanda's sister and her kids, and Vincent spent the entire afternoon revving his motorcycle in his driveway just loud enough to make conversation impossible. When I finally walked over to ask him to keep it down, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "It's my property, I can do whatever I want." There was something cold and calculating about the way he said it, like he was enjoying the power he had to make our lives miserable. Amanda's sister actually cut the visit short because her kids were getting upset by the noise. The situation escalated even further when Vincent started leaving notes, not just in our mailbox anymore, but tucked under our car windshield wipers, taped to our front door, even slipped through our mail slot. These weren't normal neighbor complaints. They were detailed lists of every perceived violation he claimed we'd committed. Things like 3:47 p.m., garage door opened too loudly, or 11:23 a.m., wife's car parked 6 inches closer to property line than usual. He was literally watching us and documenting our every move. The notes got progressively more threatening too. One of them said we were disrupting the peace of the neighborhood and that he was prepared to take necessary action to protect his rights. Amanda wanted to call the police, but I thought we should try to handle it ourselves first. I regret that decision now. The final straw came on a Wednesday morning when I was working from home and heard him shouting at Amanda in our driveway. I looked out to see him standing inches from her face, waving one of his stupid notes and calling her disrespectful and entitled. I ran outside and got between them, telling Vincent to back off and leave my wife alone. For a moment, I thought he was going to hit me. His fists were clenched, his face was purple with rage, and he was breathing like he'd just run a marathon. Instead, he started screaming about how we were the worst neighbors he'd ever had, and that we were going to regret moving to his street. Amanda was crying by this point, and I was honestly scared of what he might do next. The guy was completely unhinged, and I realized we were dealing with someone who wasn't rational or reasonable. That night, I called the non-emergency police line to file a report about the harassment. The officer who took the call was polite, but not particularly helpful. He said unless Vincent actually threatened us or damaged our property, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested we try talking to Vincent one more time or maybe contact a mediator. I remember hanging up and thinking how useless that advice was. Talk to a guy who screams at my wife for existing. The whole system seemed designed to protect people like Vincent until they actually hurt someone. For the next few months, Vincent seemed to dial back his behavior slightly. He still glared at us and still ran his leaf blower at inappropriate times, but the notes stopped and he wasn't actively confronting us anymore. Amanda and I started to relax a little, thinking maybe the police report had scared him off, or that he'd finally gotten bored with tormenting us. We even started using our backyard again, though we were always careful to stay well within our property lines. Buddy still had to be kept on a leash, which he hated, but it was a small price to pay for some peace. Then came that Sunday morning in May, the day everything changed forever. I was in the kitchen making coffee around 8 a.m. when I heard Buddy barking in the backyard. He's usually pretty quiet, so I went to check what was bothering him. Our neighbor behind us, Mrs. Patterson, has this little terrier named Gizmo, who sometimes gets excited when he sees Buddy through the fence. They'll bark back and forth for a minute or two, then lose interest. Completely normal dog behavior that every pet owner deals with. But apparently, Vincent didn't see it that way. I was still in my pajamas, barefoot, holding my coffee mug when I heard his back door slam open. He came storming into his yard, wearing what looked like the same khaki pants and polo shirt he always wore. But this time he was carrying something in his right hand. At first I thought it was a garden tool or maybe a flashlight, but as he got closer to our shared fence, I realized with a sinking feeling that it was a gun. A black pistol that looked way too big for his hand. Vincent was screaming something about noise violations and disturbing the peace, but his words were coming out so fast and angry that I could barely understand him. Buddy was still barking, completely oblivious to the danger, and I remember thinking how surreal it was that such a normal morning had turned into something out of a nightmare. Amanda was still asleep upstairs, and I desperately wanted to call out to her but didn't want to draw Vincent's attention to the house. What happened next still gives me chills. Vincent raised the gun and pointed it directly at me through our kitchen window. I could see his finger on the trigger, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he was actually going to shoot me over a barking dog. Instead, he started yelling about how we were the worst neighbors in the world, and that he was sick of our noise and disrespect. I slowly backed away from the window, my coffee mug still in my hand, trying not to make any sudden movements that might set him off. That's when I heard the first gunshot. The sound was deafening, like a firecracker going off right next to my ear, and I instinctively dropped to the floor as I heard our kitchen window explode. Glass shards flew everywhere, covering our breakfast table and the floor where I'd been standing just seconds before. I could hear Buddy yelping in terror, and Vincent was still screaming, but now his voice sounded muffled and distant. Then came the second shot, and I heard it hit something metal, probably our refrigerator or the coffee maker. I was crawling on my hands and knees through broken glass trying to get away from the window when I heard Amanda screaming my name from upstairs. She'd been woken up by the gunshots and was running down the stairs in her nightgown, completely panicked. I yelled for her to stay upstairs and call 911, but she was already in the hallway, crying and asking what was happening. I managed to crawl to the living room where my phone was charging and dialed 911 with shaking fingers, trying to explain to the dispatcher that our neighbor was shooting into our house. The whole time, I could hear Vincent outside, still yelling but getting quieter like he was walking away. Amanda came down and hugged me, both of us trembling and covered in coffee and glass fragments. I remember thinking how lucky we were that the shots had missed us. If I hadn't stepped back from the window, if Amanda had been in the kitchen making breakfast like she usually did on Sunday mornings, one of us could have been killed. The police arrived about 6 minutes later, but those 6 minutes felt like hours. The aftermath was a blur of police interviews, evidence collection, and paperwork. Vincent had apparently gone back into his house and surrendered without resistance when the officers knocked on his door. They found the gun on his kitchen counter, and he admitted to firing the shots, claiming he was defending his property from noise harassment. The detective who interviewed us said Vincent would be charged with aggravated assault and reckless endangerment, but that it could take months before we'd see any real resolution. Our insurance covered the window replacement and kitchen repairs, but they couldn't fix the feeling of being violated in our own home. We installed security cameras, changed our daily routines, and started parking in the garage instead of the driveway. Amanda has trouble sleeping now, and I find myself checking the locks multiple times before bed. Vincent was released on bail pending trial, and even though there's a restraining order in place, we know he's still living right next door. We're moving next month to a house across town, and honestly, I can't wait to leave this place behind. Sometimes I wonder if we should have taken his harassment more seriously from the beginning, but who expects their neighbor to start shooting over a barking dog? I just moved into that apartment because it was cheap and close enough to the diner where I worked double shifts. The place was one of those older red brick complexes shaped like a horseshoe, with a cracked courtyard in the middle, and a busted laundry room that always smelled like mildew. It wasn't much, but it was quiet enough, and the rent didn't eat me alive. Most of the other units seemed occupied by people who kept to themselves, except for the woman in 6B. She had a little boy who always wore dinosaur pajamas and carried this plastic flashlight around even during the day. Her name was Rachel. I only learned that because the kid, Logan, shouted it constantly while chasing pigeons in the courtyard. She must have been around my age, maybe a bit older, but looked permanently worn out, like sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. I'd run into her now and then by the mailboxes or the dumpster. We exchanged small talk. Weather, trash pickup, noise complaints. Over time, she got more comfortable. Started asking me if I wanted leftovers when she made too much pasta, or if I'd mind watching Logan for 5 minutes while she ran to her car. Harmless stuff. I didn't think anything of it at the time. The first time I saw the guy, I didn't know who he was. He showed up on a rainy Thursday afternoon while I was home early with a twisted ankle. I'd been sitting by the window with a bag of frozen peas when a black pickup rolled into the lot and parked crooked across 2 spots. The guy who stepped out looked like trouble before he even reached the stairs. Tall, broad, wearing a hoodie too clean for someone living in that building. He didn't knock when he got to 6B, just walked in like he owned it. I remember thinking maybe it was Rachel's brother or something, but the look on her face when she opened the door told me otherwise. She wasn't expecting him. After that, he came around more often. Never stayed long, but the tension in the building shifted when he was there. You'd hear things. Low voices turning sharp, doors slamming, Logan crying. I started recognizing the sound of that truck engine before it even turned into the lot. Rachel stopped talking to me as much. No more leftovers, no more small talk by the mailbox. She started keeping the blinds shut all the time. Logan didn't run around in his pajamas anymore either. He stopped smiling altogether. And I told myself it wasn't my business. That maybe things weren't as bad as they looked. That someone else would say something if something needed saying. One night, close to midnight, I was lying on the couch half asleep when I heard this crash, like something heavy hitting drywall. Then came the shouting. Not loud enough to catch every word, but sharp enough to make my chest tighten. Rachel's voice came through first, panicked and too fast to follow. Then his, lower, slower, like he didn't care who heard. What hit me wasn't the volume, but the silence that came after. It stretched for maybe 30 seconds, and I just sat there, staring at my ceiling fan, frozen in place. Then Logan screamed. Not cried, screamed, and I still didn't move. The next morning, I went out early under the excuse of grabbing coffee from the gas station, even though I had a full bag at home. Their door was closed, but there was a long scrape down the wood like something had been dragged across it. On the concrete landing outside 6B, there was a single Spider-Man sneaker. I remember standing there staring at that shoe for longer than made sense. I picked it up and left it by their door, then walked down to my car like none of it had happened. Told myself again that maybe things were complicated. Maybe there was context I didn't have. Weeks passed, then months. The guy's visits became less frequent, but when he did show up, the air in that courtyard got heavy. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of Rachel through the window, always hunched over, arms crossed, like she was trying to make herself smaller. Logan stopped playing outside altogether. I remember one afternoon I came home to find him standing on their balcony, gripping the metal rail with both hands and just staring down at the parking lot. He didn't blink when I waved. Just turned and walked inside like I wasn't there. That image stuck with me more than the yelling ever did. Then came the night they vanished. It had rained earlier, and the pavement still had that smell like wet metal. Around 10 p.m., I heard the usual sound of the truck pulling in, engine louder than it needed to be. The argument started almost immediately. Furniture scraping, something slamming hard enough to rattle the glass. I stood by my window again, fists clenched without realizing it. At one point, I heard a thud that made the floor vibrate beneath my feet, followed by Logan yelling his mother's name. That time, I actually reached for my phone and didn't dial. Just stood there, phone in hand, while everything went quiet again. By the next morning, their apartment was silent. No footsteps, no cartoons through the walls, no Logan knocking his toys against the floor. Their car was gone too. I waited a day, then two. On the third day, a maintenance guy came by to change the locks. That was the first confirmation I got that something serious had happened. I asked him, trying to sound casual, and he just said, "Management's clearing it out, said they left in a rush." Then he shook his head and added, "Can't say I'm surprised with the kind of company she had." That was it. No one else asked. No one else said a word. It wasn't until a week later that I saw Rachel's face again, on the local news, right before the weather segment. The headline read, "Local woman hospitalized after domestic assault. Suspect still at large." Her photo didn't look anything like how I remembered her. Her left eye was swollen shut, and there was a cut across her temple that looked fresh. They blurred Logan's face in the footage, but I recognized his posture, the way he clung to her jacket. The report said they'd found her at a rest stop 2 towns over, badly injured, barely conscious, with the boy trying to keep her awake. The man, her ex, had taken off before paramedics arrived. After that, I couldn't sit in my apartment the same way. Every sound from the courtyard made me jump. I started keeping the blinds closed, but not because I had something to hide, because I couldn't stop imagining what I hadn't seen, or worse, what I had seen and chosen to ignore. I'd lie awake at night thinking about the moment I held my phone and didn't call, the way I pretended that shoe on the concrete didn't mean anything. No one came to question me. No cops knocked on my door. It was like I was invisible the whole time, and that made it worse. I could have done something. I didn't. Eventually, I moved. Found a place across town, quieter, no balconies, no kids yelling in the courtyard. But I still think about Rachel and Logan. I have no idea where they are now. If they're safe, if the guy ever got caught, if the kid ever went back to wearing his Dino pajamas and running around without fear. I tell myself maybe by not interfering, I gave her space to find a way out. But deep down, I know that's just me trying to sleep at night. I was close enough to hear every second of that nightmare, and I did nothing. That's the part that sticks. That's the part I still carry. People always talk about how nothing ever happens in the suburbs, but that's not true. I grew up in a small cul-de-sac outside of Des Moines, where everyone knew what kind of cereal their neighbors ate for breakfast, and still somehow missed the darkest things happening right next door. Back then, I was 16, stuck between AP classes and mowing lawns for gas money. My parents worked a lot. My dad in logistics, my mom managing a dentist's office. So I had the kind of freedom most kids that age shouldn't have. I spent a lot of afternoons riding my bike around the neighborhood or just killing time on my phone in the garage. Windows open, music low enough not to piss off the retirees across the street. There was this house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Brown shutters, cracked driveway, always looked like it was stuck in a thunderstorm even when the sun was out. That's where the Halverson family lived. The dad had bailed years ago, and the mom never talked to anyone unless it was to shout through a screen door. The older son, Curtis, was probably 19 at the time, and had that sort of wired, twitchy energy like a dog raised on fireworks. Most people avoided them, but not their daughter, Mia. She was a year younger than me, quiet, always reading on the porch steps or sketching in a notebook she guarded like it held nuclear codes. We started talking by accident one afternoon. I was fixing my bike chain, swearing under my breath, and she was walking by with her sketch pad. She stopped, crouched next to me, and offered me a paper towel from her backpack. That was it. It was simple, normal, even kind of sweet. We started meeting up after school. Never in her house, never in mine. Just long walks around the neighborhood, sitting on the swings at the elementary school, talking about music, dumb teachers, or nothing at all. It felt like our own little world, sealed off from the weird tension coming from her house. The first time I stepped into their basement, it wasn't planned. It was early evening, just starting to get dark. Mia had said her mom wasn't home, and she wanted to show me something, some drawings, I think. We went through the kitchen and down the stairs, and instantly, the air changed. The basement wasn't finished, just bare concrete floors, exposed insulation, and a mattress leaned against the far wall with a thin blanket folded on top. One corner had tools hanging from rusty hooks, some still dusted with dried mud or paint. It felt like a place you weren't supposed to be in, like even the walls had secrets they were keeping quiet. But Mia acted normal, like none of it was strange. So I stayed. We sat on an old folding chair and a crate while she flipped through her sketchbook. Her drawings were incredible, way beyond what you'd expect from a sophomore. Most were portraits of people she'd never met, she said, just faces that came to her. But some looked like her family. One was unmistakably Curtis, sitting hunched in a corner with his hands covering his face. Another showed their kitchen table, but the shadows underneath were too dark, like something was crawling just out of sight. I was staring at that one when I heard a sound upstairs, sharp, like a shoe scraping the tile. Mia went completely still. Her eyes flicked to the ceiling, then back to me. "You have to go," she whispered. I didn't argue. I slipped out the back door, cutting through their overgrown yard and hopping the fence into Mr. Dalton's. I didn't even look back. That was the first time I realized how serious things might be in that house. But I kept seeing Mia after that, more carefully. Always outside, never near her place again. We'd text sometimes, and she always replied with short answers, never anything direct. Then one Saturday, everything blew up. I'd biked to the little strip mall a mile away to grab a soda and kill time. On the way back, I cut through the path behind the woods, near the drainage ditch. That's when I heard someone call my name. Curtis was standing by the trees, holding a long-handled wrench in one hand. I still remember the way his free hand kept twitching at his side, like he didn't quite know what to do with it. He didn't say anything at first, just stared, breathing heavy, like he'd been running. "You think you can sneak around," he finally said. "You think nobody notices?" I backed away, trying to stay calm, told him I didn't know what he was talking about. But he started walking toward me, slow at first, then picking up speed. I dropped the soda and ran. I don't even know how I managed to outpace him, but I cut through the fence behind the old auto shop and sprinted the rest of the way home, heart jackhammering in my chest. I locked myself in the garage and stayed there until it was fully dark. When my mom got home later that night, I acted like I'd just been working on music all day. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell anyone. Part of me thought maybe Curtis was just trying to scare me. Maybe that was the end of it. But for weeks after, I kept seeing things. A figure standing across the street at midnight. My bike chain snapped clean in half one morning, like it had been sliced. A dead bird placed on our doorstep. I knew it was him, but I didn't know what he was capable of. Not yet. Everything came to a head one rainy afternoon, about a month after the wrench incident. I was home alone. My parents were out shopping for a new dryer, and I'd just finished reheating leftover pizza when the power went out. Not the whole neighborhood, just our house. I looked outside and noticed every other porch light still glowing. That was the first crack in the air. I grabbed the flashlight from under the sink, walked to the basement door, and saw that it was slightly open. We never left it like that. I stood there for a second, trying to convince myself it was just the draft. But then I heard the creak of a footstep on the basement stairs. Something took over in me. I didn't try to confront whoever it was. I didn't play hero. I ran out the front door barefoot, sprinted 2 houses down, and banged on the Dorsey's door until Mr. Dorsey opened it, holding a mug of tea in his flannel pajama pants. He could tell something was wrong just by looking at me. He called the cops right away. By the time they arrived, whoever was in our basement was gone. But the back window had been jimmied open, and someone had left behind muddy prints across the floor. There were greasy hand marks on the inside of the fuse box. The officer took my statement, but I didn't mention Curtis by name. I was still too scared. I didn't want to make it worse. A week later, the Halversons moved out in the middle of the night. No warning, no goodbye. Just a U-Haul and a flickering porch light that went dark before sunrise. I never saw Mia again. Never heard from her either. I kept waiting for some kind of explanation, something to wrap it all up in my head. But it never came. Life went on. I graduated, went to college, moved out of state, and for a while I thought maybe it had all just faded. But the fear didn't. It just got quiet, dormant. Then, a few months ago, I was at a hardware store in Omaha picking up sandpaper for a side project. I turned a corner in the plumbing aisle and saw him, Curtis. Same twitch in his jaw, same stare that didn't blink enough. He didn't say anything, just looked at me like he'd been waiting for me to show up there. I didn't stick around, dropped what I was holding and walked straight out of the store. Haven't been back since. I don't know where he lives now, I don't know what he wants, but just knowing he's still out there, still looking like that, it brought everything back. The basement, the wrench, the silence that followed. Some things don't end. They just circle back.